Tutorials. If you've ever played a video game, odds are you've encountered some variation of these, many of which come in the form of simple pop-up text windows such as these. Most would agree that tutorials are a necessary part of games. Their presence encourages accessibility and inclusivity by providing an explanation of the game's mechanics, rules, and controls to new players. In their article, Master of the Game, Assessing Approachability in Future Game Design, authors Deservire and Weiberg further discuss the importance of game tutorials and outline game approachability principles, or GAP, which are a set of guidelines with which game designers are encouraged to craft better tutorials, especially for new and casual players. The goal of these principles is to make games friendly, fun, immersive, and accessible for those players who have the desire to play, yet do not always follow through to actually playing the game. In spite of the clear importance of tutorials, however, the word tutorial is one that frequently sends shivers down the spines of avid gamers the world over. Why is that? What is it about a simple in-game lesson that so often leads to such strong feelings of vexation and indignation among ardent players? Among the handful of gripes players have with tutorials, one of them stems from how they can interfere with immersion. Many gamers play games primarily to become immersed in a new world or story as a form of escapism. When a tutorial suddenly pops up, it can completely derail any sense of immersion, which sometimes results in a substantially less enjoyable experience for a great number of people. Similarly, tutorials like those described previously can hamper the flow of gameplay. While this may refer to the pacing of the game itself, it can also refer to the level of focus one can achieve within the game. When focusing enough on a game, the mind can enter a zen-like state similar to meditation. This can be seen as a higher level of immersion, and that of course means that it's subject to interruption in much the same way other forms of immersion are. Some gamers simply find the presence of such tutorials demeaning. Learning and experiencing a video game on your own is a major draw of the medium for many people, after all. It typically feels much more satisfying to achieve something on your own rather than through the guidance of a set of instructions. Including an element that holds the player's hand and tells them exactly what to do can result in feelings of discovery and curiosity being replaced with annoyance and frustration. Now, you may have noticed a theme among these issues. Each of them only really applies to a certain type of tutorial, the kind that this kind. The type of tutorial that completely interrupts the experience. But this raises some interesting questions. What other types of tutorials are there? How can players be taught the rules and mechanics of a game without the experience being interrupted like this? Is such a thing even possible? I'm here to argue that, yes, not only is it possible, but it's something that's already been done before, and not only has it been done, but it's been done masterfully. For proof, look no further than FromSoftware. Before exploring FromSoft's library of games, it's important to better understand tutorials and the forms they can take in games. Tutorial is often used as a very broad umbrella term, with many things being considered a tutorial in the context of a video game. For the sake of this video, I'll be dividing tutorials into two categories, conspicuous and inconspicuous. The conspicuous category includes things like pop-up tutorials and detailed explanations. These are the kinds of tutorials that, as explained before, can interrupt the experience. But don't get the wrong idea, they can also be used effectively if done correctly. Inconspicuous tutorials, on the other hand, are those that the player isn't likely to notice. They're blended seamlessly into the gameplay itself, encouraging the player to experiment and discover things on their own. Recently, author and game designer Ian Bogost has introduced a rhetorical concept that has been applied to these kinds of tutorials known as procedural rhetoric, which is defined as the art of persuasion by rule-based representations and interactions rather than spoken or written word. Bogost argues that video games have unique persuasive power in terms of politics, advertising, and, for our purposes, education. This is a field of rhetoric that many researchers have since begun to explore. One such researcher is Simon Ferrari, who discusses procedural rhetoric and the intersubjective judgment of games, accounting for both the rule set of the game and the subjectivity of player experience, with tutorials of course serving as a great example of designers accounting for the role of the player. There are opponents of this idea, however, such as Dr. Miguel Sicart, who argues procedural rhetoric is flawed and can be limited in its application. In terms of the two types of tutorials I've described so far, some games utilize only conspicuous tutorials, some only inconspicuous, and others utilize a mix of both. In the case of FromSoftware's Soulsborne games, while both forms are used expertly and to great effect, I'll be diving into how FromSoftware's games utilize procedural rhetoric in a way that allows them to teach the player without interrupting or impeding the experience. Over the past 13 years, FromSoftware, a Japanese game development studio, has been releasing genre-defining action RPGs under the direction of Hidetaka Miyazaki. This collection of games includes Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and the recently released Elden Ring. Many of these games serve as spiritual successors to previous games released by the studio, meaning they carry over many of the same design principles without being directly linked. The exception to this are the 3 entries in the Dark Souls franchise, which are connected as part of the same series, but we'll only be focusing on the first Dark Souls game. These games and the wider genre they fall into have come to be referred to by the gaming industry at large as Souls-like or Soulsborne games, a name derived from the combination of Dark Souls and Bloodborne. From here on, I'll be referring to this subgenre as Soulsborne. So what is a Soulsborne game? Well, let's start by analyzing the very first Soulsborne game, Demon's Souls. Initially released in 2009 to little fanfare, Demon's Souls slowly built up a cult following as more and more people began to discover it. It was the first FromSoftware game to feature many of the rules and mechanics that would later come to define not only the Soulsborne genre, but action RPGs as a whole. These include the third-person perspective, the stamina management system, the roguelike elements, and the Metroidvania-esque level design. For those who are unaware, roguelike refers to games with rules and mechanics similar to that of the 1980 game Rogue, such as dungeon crawling elements and a significant loss of progress upon death. Metroidvania, a name derived from the combination of Metroid and Castlevania, refers to games with maze-like open-world level design that encourages exploration and experimentation to make progress. The elements of these genres inform much of Demon's Souls' design. Just like in roguelike games, the player loses a notable amount of progress with each death. In the case of Demon's Souls, upon dying, players are sent back to the very beginning of the level and lose their souls, the currency needed to level up. This means the player must repeat sizable sections of the game in order to reclaim their lost souls and overcome whatever challenge faces them. Likewise, Metroidvanias inform the open, labyrinthian level design of Demon's Souls. The game is divided into 5 separate levels within what are known in the game's story as archstones. Each one contains its own unique Metroidvania-esque structure, but rather than requiring specific items or power-ups to proceed through certain sections, progression in Demon's Souls is only impeded by enemies and obstacles of varying difficulty. By playing through each level, the player can determine which one has the right level of difficulty for them and can proceed and level up accordingly, allowing them to take on bigger and tougher challenges. You're also free to jump between levels as you see fit. If one challenge is seeming a bit too difficult, simply hop over to another archstone and give that one a try instead. Now that we've gained a better understanding of what comprises the Soulsborne formula, we can finally start to analyze the approach these games take to tutorials through the rhetorical lens of procedural rhetoric. After creating your own character and viewing an opening cinematic that establishes the story driving you forward, the player finds themselves in a narrow hallway. We see various UI elements, the meanings of which will become clear soon. From here, the only direction is forward. For most players, the act of walking forward using the left joystick is practically instinctual, but for inexperienced players or even completely new players who've never touched a video game before, this pathway gives them a safe environment to experiment with the controls and discover what input allows them to move forward. From here, the player will approach a glowing mark on the ground. Naturally, your attention is drawn to this shining symbol, so you walk up to it. When standing above the sigil, a small text window appears, prompting the player to press X to read a message. While this may seem like a conspicuous tutorial, many games provide small windows like this to suggest that an item can be interacted with and showcases the input used to do so. Such isn't typically viewed as a tutorial, but the context in which this message is used does actually make it one. Messages are something the player will interact with throughout their experience in Demon's Souls, so by placing one at the very beginning in a narrow hallway without distractions, the player is naturally drawn to it and learns that messages are something that can be interacted with to obtain valuable information. In this case, the message tells the player which button allows them to attack. Pressing this button activates a weapon swinging animation, giving the player an indication of the distance and speed of their attack. Something else you may have noticed is the depletion of some of the green meter at the top, which immediately begins to refill. If the player continues pressing the attack button, they'll learn not only about combo attacks, but also that they can no longer attack once the green meter is empty. Isn't that so cool? From one completely optional message, the player is able to learn so much information primarily through their own experimentation. After this, the hallway leads the player to a larger, more open room with another person inside of it. Now remember, while the fact that this is an enemy may seem obvious to some, completely new players may be oblivious to this fact. However, the nature of this knight becomes clear the second he begins attacking you. From this, not only do we learn about the existence of enemies that attack the player, but we also learn that this red meter at the top is an indication of health. Presumably, when this meter reaches 0, the player will die. And if the player can't put that together at this point, then they're quickly going to learn that's the case. However, another detail you'll notice is the red meter above the enemy's head. Logically, this must be another health meter similar to our own, and by utilizing the attack button we've just learned about, we can hit the enemy and lower its health. With one more hit, the enemy's down. Next, the only path to proceed is towards a second glowing message near another hallway. Reading this message instructs the player on how to sprint, and thanks to the length of this hallway, the player is given plenty of distance to gain a feel for how running works. Much of the same procedural rhetoric we've discussed so far continues on through the rest of the opening segment as we face more enemies and read more messages. We learn more useful techniques like blocking and locking on. Further on, we find a body with a glowing aura on top of it inside of a tight staircase, once again drawing the player towards it. This aura turns out to be an item called Crescent Moon Grass. If you've paid attention, you'll see that Crescent Moon Grass is already present on the lower left-hand side of the screen with a square icon located right above it. Pressing the square button will cause you to consume one of these Crescent Moon Grasses, and assuming you've already taken damage from the enemies you've encountered thus far, you'll learn that the grass allows you to recover health. Proceeding past this point brings you to a bridge with a message that clarifies the input needed to consume an item, in case you'd failed to notice the grass in your inventory by that point. Walk further down the bridge and you'll be met with a dead end. However, another glowing item draws your attention towards a damaged section of the bridge. As you stand above the item to pick it up, you're almost certain to notice something, a glowing message placed down below, wordlessly encouraging you to jump down. The height may be intimidating, but the item the game has provided you with is more Crescent Moon Grass. This is the game's way of telling the player that they can take the plunge without worrying about any possible damage received from falling. Now we find ourselves in the widest open area yet. Interacting with this message reveals to the player the input needed to perform a backstep and a dodge roll. Dodging is a vital aspect of Demon Souls as it allows you to avoid taking damage, and this open area is the perfect place to get used to it. A handful of enemies are thrown at you, but without any narrow, tight spaces to worry about, the player can roll in any direction to their heart's content. Dodging, of course, consumes stamina as well, which is something that also becomes clear as the player experiments with it. This area also contains an archstone, which, as you may remember, is a means by which the player can traverse levels. Just like everything the game wants the player to interact with, this object glows brightly and is placed in an easily noticeable position, naturally drawing the player's attention. Interacting with it will send the player to the next segment of the tutorial, teaching players about the object's level traversing properties. From here, the player is sent to the next section of the starting area. Many of the same principles of procedural rhetoric seen thus far continue to appear, with more messages to read, items to collect, and enemies to overcome. Something to note here is how the level design becomes more complex, easing the player into the highly detailed, maze-like map design that they can expect to see throughout the rest of Demon Souls. Eventually, the player finds themselves faced with a massive, imposing fog wall, prompting them to enter. Upon entering, the player encounters their very first boss enemy, the Vanguard Demon. Here, your knowledge of what you've learned so far is put to the test, and by putting that knowledge to good use, even a challenge this terrifying can surely be— So, you died. Time to try again, right? Well, actually no, you can't try again. You're dead. Instead, the player is shown a cutscene of their soul being transported to the Nexus, a sort of hub world where you can access archstones that lead to each of the game's levels. As it turns out, you were expected to die to this first boss. See, in Demon Souls, death is a mechanic unto itself, transforming you into something called the soul form, where your health is reduced by half. The only way to regain your physical body, and by extension your health, is by defeating a demon boss. By pitting the player against a boss they aren't expected to beat, not only does Demon Souls teach you about the soul form and hub world, but it also showcases how certain obstacles on your journey may seem insurmountable. That doesn't mean there's no way forward, however. After arriving in the Nexus, a character explains through a cutscene how this place works and what the soul form is. This explanation could be seen as a sort of conspicuous tutorial, but by having it explained to you by a character within the context of the game's world, it feels less like a tutorial and more like part of the story, avoiding the immersion-ruining pitfalls of other similar tutorials. In the Nexus, there's plenty of space for the player to explore, but it's most likely they'll immediately be drawn to this blue, glowing, sitting fellow. Someone less familiar with video games may assume, based on what we've learned before, that this man is an enemy, just like those other knights in the beginning. But the fact that this man is sitting communicates his lack of hostility. Approaching him prompts the player to talk to him, and doing so engages a cutscene where he encourages you to enter a level through one of the 5 archstones in the Nexus. As I described earlier in the video, any archstone can be entered at any time, but they vary wildly in difficulty. Conveniently, however, or rather, purposefully, the man is sitting directly next to the easiest archstone, wordlessly guiding the player down the recommended path. Demon Souls continues teaching players through procedural rhetoric throughout the entire game, but for the purposes of this video, the game's tutorial ends here. It's fascinating to see just how much thought goes into something the player doesn't even think about. The effort put into making sure the player learns the rules and mechanics of the game in an organic, non-intrusive way at their own pace is extraordinarily impressive, especially considering that this was FromSoftware's first crack at such a game. Now that we've gained a better understanding of the sort of design language that comprises educational procedural rhetoric in Demon's Souls, we can apply that knowledge to FromSoftware's other Soulsborne titles. You could say that this is the end of this video's tutorial. The next Soulsborne game released was 2011's Dark Souls. While Demon's Souls gained somewhat of a cult following, this game was the one that catapulted the Soulsborne series to the front of the public mind. It's not difficult to see how this game borrows practically all of its design aspects from its predecessor. It's even in the name, after all. Similar to Demon's Souls, the game opens with a character creator and a cutscene that establishes the story. What separates this opening segment, however, is how streamlined it is. After waking up in a cell, the player is thrown a key from above by a mysterious knight. By using this key to escape, the player can enter into the hallway outside. Multiple messages provide optional information on the controls much sooner and far more frequently than in Demon's Souls. After climbing a ladder, the player comes across a glowing mound on the ground with a sword in the middle of a wide-open room, immediately catching their eye. Interacting with it will light the bonfire, which then prompts the player to rest at it. If the player has taken damage from any of the enemies up to this point, they'll discover that resting at this bonfire restores their health. However, another function of this object will become clear shortly. From here, the player will surely be drawn to the giant door straight ahead of them. Upon opening it, you'll discover an even larger room with a message towards the middle. Reading this— oh my god. Just like in Demon's Souls, the player's not expected to beat this boss. It's assumed you'll die. Through death, however, the player discovers something very important. Bonfires are checkpoints. After respawning, the player can enter the large room once more and continue looking for a way out, as the message suggests. Here's a challenge for you. Based on the principles of procedural rhetoric and tutorial design we've discussed so far, where do you think you should go? If you guessed towards the glowing torches, you'd be right. Going through this door causes it to close behind you, saving you from the big, scary demon. More of this same tutorial-based procedural rhetoric continues from this point, such as teaching the player about shields in a long hallway with an enemy archer to give them plenty of space to practice. Heading up these stairs, an Indiana Jones-style trap will activate. It's unlikely this will kill you, and instead it serves to introduce the player to the possibility of traps. Going past where the boulder came from takes you to a locked door, with the only option being to turn around. If you hadn't noticed before, heading back down will certainly make clear that the boulder has revealed a previously hidden room. Hidden paths are a major part of the rest of the Souls series, so introducing the concept to the player early on is important, and doing so through the same inconspicuous tutorial that teaches the player about traps is genius. Inside this hidden room, the player will find the same knight that tossed them the key at the start of the game, highlighted by a literal spotlight. Talking with him will reveal he's dying, and he requests the player carry on his legacy. He'll provide the player with Estus flasks and a key to the locked door. These flasks are the player's primary method of healing, with a message next to the knight informing you that your Estus replenishes at bonfires. Continue on through the locked door and you'll soon come across a massive fog wall next to a message that provides the controls for doing a plunging attack. Proceed through the fog and you'll find yourself placed above the boss from earlier. Using the skills you've honed to this point, it's time for revenge. This time, you can quite literally get the drop on the boss yourself, wiping out half of its health in a single hit. A challenge that once seemed insurmountable just became much more manageable thanks to the knowledge you've gained. Oh, how the tables have turned. After defeating the boss, you collect the key and proceed on with the rest of the game. Compared to Demon's Souls, not only did Dark Souls manage to create a much more effective and efficient tutorial, but it also does a better job of serving the game's story. You start locked in a cell in Undead Asylum at your lowest point imaginable, making the awe-inspiring feats you achieve throughout your playthrough all the more impactful and satisfying. A trend among these opening tutorials so far has been their decreasing length. This certainly carries over into the next game, 2015's Bloodborne. The tutorial segment of this game is shockingly short. After the usual character creation and opening cutscene we've come to expect at this point, the player is free to explore the dark clinic they find themselves in. Optional messages can be found throughout if you need help learning the controls. Almost immediately, you'll stumble upon your first and only real obstacle in this tutorial segment, a large, intimidating beast. Once again, you're expected to lose to this enemy. Just like in Demon's Souls, dying will send you to the game's hub world, Hunter's Dream. Here, the player is provided with a selection of weapons to choose from and some more optional messages instructing them on how to use each weapon. You can mosey around in this area as much as you like, but you'll find that the only way to leave is to interact with a certain tombstone, similar to the Archstones in Demon's Souls. Doing so will send you back to the clinic. Now armed with the weapons of your choosing and the knowledge you've gained, you can finally take down the beast that slew you earlier, giving you a taste of the game's cycle of learning from each death and overcoming seemingly impossible odds. Like I said, very short. Well, we're about to stray from not only this pattern, but quite a few other patterns as well. Of all the Soulsborne games, 2019's Sekiro Shadows Die Twice deviates the most from the formula. Gone are the character creator and stamina management systems of the previous games. Instead, this game shifts its focus towards its character-driven story and stealth gameplay. As a ninja in feudal Japan, you'll have to sneak past countless enemies in order to survive. After the opening cutscene, the player finds themselves at the bottom of a well with a letter dropped beside them. Reading this letter informs you of your goal: escape from the well and reach a tower. Stepping forward, the first thing blocking the player's path is a ledge that's too tall to walk over. This is where everything you thought you knew about Soulsborne games goes out the window. Sekiro has a jump button. Using this button will allow you to proceed past these ledges. Have you noticed something else that's different so far? As opposed to the tutorials in every other Soulsborne game, Sekiro lacks any of the messages used to teach players controls or provide them other useful information. Instead, the player is shown small prompts on the side of the screen that serve the same purpose. After escaping the well and learning how to cling to walls, Sekiro once again does something shocking. It presents the player with a pop-up tutorial. How could they? After praising them so much for their masterful, inconspicuous tutorials, FromSoft goes and ruins everything with a pop-up. Well, as controversial as it may be to say, there are times when a conspicuous tutorial like this is necessary as opposed to an inconspicuous one. In this case, without this pop-up, the player would likely run into the enemies ahead and become quickly overwhelmed with things they don't understand. They die pretty quickly over and over again without ever knowing what they're doing wrong. In complicated situations like these, conspicuous tutorials, in spite of their immersion-ruining potential, are the best option. One could argue that what this does go to show is FromSoft's aversion to such tutorials, using them only when absolutely necessary. By sneaking through the tall grass, the player's path is funneled to beneath a building, where they're prompted to eavesdrop, another mechanic that will be used multiple times in the future. Similar to messages in previous Soulsborne games, this is a very important way to gain valuable information. After crawling out from under the building, the player is already facing a nearby tower, surely the tower they've been told to find. Traversing along the cliffside, the player practices some more traversal skills before entering the tower through a hole in the side. Notice the glowing candles that draw your eye to it. Every Soulsborne game has utilized this technique to draw your attention so far, but countless other games do it as well. Try keeping your eyes open for it next time you play a game. Upon entering the building, a cutscene is engaged where Sekiro is reunited with his young lord Kuro, who bestows upon him his katana. Kuro also gives the player healing gourds, which serve the same purpose as the Estus flasks from Dark Souls. The young lord then provides you with a new set of instructions. Locate a secret passage beneath a moat bridge in order to escape. After leaving through the tower's front doorway, the player can begin to take on the enemies they had to sneak past before. But if you try to fight them all at once, you're gonna have a bad time. The key is to make effective use of the stealth techniques you've learned to take down the enemies one by one. Other complex mechanics are taught through conspicuous tutorials like parrying, posture, and dealing death blows. By sneaking and stealth killing your way to the main gate, you can pass through and face your first mini-boss. He may not look it, but this enemy is far tougher than those you've faced before. Like the tutorial bosses of the past in other Soulsborne games, he serves as a sort of exam to test your knowledge of everything you've learned so far. He may be difficult to defeat, but the designers have given this character an absolutely massive sword in order to make reading his attacks as easy as possible. After overcoming this challenge, the player can proceed under the bridge and call Kuro to enter the secret passage. Through this cavern, a cutscene begins where Sekiro and Kuro are stopped by a samurai, Lord Genichiro. The first real boss fight has begun. The player will more than likely quickly be bested by Genichiro. Another cutscene follows, indicating that this is once again a fight the player was not expected to win. After cutting off Sekiro's arm, Genichiro kidnaps Kuro and runs off, leaving Sekiro to die. But remember, shadows die twice. Sekiro survives this encounter, marking the end of the opening tutorial segment. Compared to previous Soulsborne games, Sekiro's tutorial, just like its gameplay, is a bit of an outlier. It's a lot more conspicuous, but due to the much more complex mechanics and rules of Sekiro, this makes sense. However, that doesn't mean the extremely intelligent design principles we've come to expect from FromSoftware aren't present. And with that, we're on to the last Soulsborne game I'll be covering in this analysis, this year's recently released Elden Ring. Many people consider Elden Ring to be the culmination of FromSoft's Soulsborne games up to this point. The gameplay pulls from each of the previous titles we've discussed in order to build the ultimate Soulsborne experience. It follows then that the opening tutorial should be similarly cumulative. That's it. That's the tutorial. Okay, I'm only kidding. That was me skipping past the tutorial entirely. That's right, in Elden Ring the tutorial is completely optional. This makes the game much more enjoyable for seasoned players and makes the game far more replayable. Let's start back at the very beginning. After the long-awaited return of the character creator and an expected opening cutscene, we begin in a dark, musty room. We're immediately greeted by a glowing item that will likely catch your eye, this one being a tool for leaving messages in the open world for other players. Elden Ring has a greater focus on multiplayer, so it's good to have this element introduced immediately. Next to the item is a message giving you your objective. Though the path be broken and uncertain, claim your place as Elden Lord. Proceed forward down the only path available and oh my gosh, there's a boss already! Don't be alarmed though. If you've been paying attention, you can probably already guess that, yes, you're supposed to lose this fight. One flesh wound and story cutscene later and we end up back here. A message informs you that the Cave of Knowledge lies below. Here, a ghost in a chair next to a chasm beckons the player to take the plunge of learning and remembrance. Now, if you ignore this ghost, for all intents and purposes, the opening segment of the game ends here. Jumping down into the cave, however, begins a lengthier, more in-depth tutorial. After falling, the player receives a bit of fall damage, upon which they are prompted to use an item. This is a very organic way of introducing fall damage and healing. As we proceed forward into the Cave of Knowledge, we... No. Not again. How could they do it to us again? Well, once again, I feel that this is an instance where such a conspicuous tutorial is justified. Seeing as the cave serves as a completely optional tutorial, it makes sense that those who enter are likely there to learn rather than to be immersed. Elden Ring, like Sekiro, is a very complicated game with deep mechanics. With this taken into consideration, I think pop-up tutorials like these make a lot of sense, and their optional context means they aren't taking away from the experience of those who don't need them. After resting at a a site of grace, the player continues forward and encounters their first basic enemy. He's facing a wall and standing still, making him quite the pushover and perfect for learning the ropes. Beat him and you can proceed forward to take on more enemies, but be careful, this time they bite back. Mechanics like guarding and dodging are introduced along the way. Further on into the cave, we come across some ledges and learn something incredible. The jump button is back! After this, we enter a large grassy cavern where a bowman beyond our reach begins shooting at us. How rude. We run beneath him to escape his line of fire, and these glowing plants catch our eye. Once prompted to interact with them, you can collect them, triggering a pop-up tutorial explaining their use for crafting various items. Moving onward, we learn some more combat techniques and take down more competent enemies. Walking up through this cave allows us to reach the bridge from where this bowman was firing at us, giving us our chance at sweet revenge, along with the tutorial for using bows. Further inward and we learn about Elden Ring's stealth mechanic. The player is placed in a room full of bushes perfect for sneaking and enemies just asking to be snuck up on. Like many of FromSoft's tutorial segments, this is a playground for experimentation. After sneaking our hearts out, we make our way to a mysterious golden fog wall. Traversing through it places us into this tutorial's boss fight, the Soldier of Godric. Though he may seem a bit intimidating, this fella's no tougher than the other schmoes in the cave. Use your newfound combat knowledge to beat him up like you would any other enemy. Now you can exit the Cave of Knowledge and arrive back here. Both figuratively and literally, you have risen above Elden Ring's tutorial. Though this tutorial segment is certainly reliant on pop-ups, they're fitting given the context. A different player, the kind that skips the Cave of Knowledge, would be completely unaware of this game's pop-ups. It's all a matter of perspective, and Elden Ring provides a perspective for both new and experienced players alike. And with that, our analysis is complete. And what a journey it's been, all the way from the claustrophobic dungeon corridors of Demon Souls to the wide-open hills and jagged mountains of Elden Ring. We've seen how FromSoftware's clever use of inconspicuous tutorials and sparing use of conspicuous tutorials has led to some of the most immersive and compelling tutorial segments in all of gaming. Elements like glowing objects and lights to subconsciously guide the player along, with components that wordlessly teach the player about multiple mechanics and rules at once. These are a commonality among these tutorials, and the amount of forethought and effort that goes into making them so effective is astounding. While tutorials are often criticized for their overbearing presence and obnoxious intrusions, FromSoftware's Soulsborne games show that a tutorial can not only avoid these pitfalls, but serve as a fun and engaging part of the game itself. I hope that from this point onward, you pay more attention to the procedural rhetoric in the games you play. Someone worked hard on that, and it usually goes unnoticed. Thank you so much for watching.